Okay, I think we're ready to start. Welcome everybody. My name is Eric Goldstein. I am the Judith London Evans Director of the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Brickman-Levin Symposium here at Emory University. We're so glad so many of you could join us via Zoom tonight. First, I want to thank our co-sponsor, the James T. Laney Graduate School here at Emory. And I'd also like to thank our executive director at TAM, Paul Entis, and our communications coordinator, Brent Buckley, for all the work they did in putting this program together. Tonight's program has two purposes. First of all, it is intended to honor Perry Brickman and the late Arthur Levin, who are the two heroes of the story of discrimination at the former Emory Dental School. A story which some of you know about, which took place between the years 1948 and 1961. During those years, under the deanship of John Buehler, 65% of the Jewish students in the dental school faced some sort of discrimination. They were either made to repeat, they were given failing grades, and in some cases they were asked to leave the school unfairly. And this discrimination went on for several years, and many of the people who experienced it were not even aware that it was part of a larger pattern of anti-Semitism in the school. After many years, there were some attempts to address it, and particularly the local chapter of the ADL in Atlanta started to investigate and produce some statistics under the leadership of the late Arthur Levin, who was the head of the Atlanta branch of the ADL. And so I mentioned he's one of the heroes of this story. He is the person who first compiled this information about this pattern of discrimination and brought it to the attention of Emory officials starting in the late 50s and culminating in the early 1960s when the case was written about and publicized in the press and even in a book about anti-Semitism published by the ADL. But the case at that time, although it was discussed, the discussion of it was limited to statistics. The names of the people who had been affected were never brought to light or discussed, probably at that time to protect them. Emory at that time always denied that there had been anti-Semitic discrimination. And so in many ways, the case was never fully addressed. And then years later, the other hero of the story, Perry Brickman, helped bring the details of this whole story to light. Perry was one of the students who suffered discrimination, was asked to leave the dental school, and here he is pictured with his wife, Shirley, and I'll recognize them in a minute, they're in our audience. And Perry went on to be an honors student at the University of Tennessee, did dental school, and went on to a distinguished career as a dentist, an oral surgeon, and also a community leader in the Atlanta Jewish community and the Atlanta community more generally. And years later, he became interested and became more aware that this was a pattern of discrimination, that he was one of many victims. In around 2006, 2007, he began researching who the other victims were, contacting them, interviewing them, and started the beginning of a project which would culminate in this case becoming more widely known. First, in 2012, his research became the subject of a documentary film called From Silence to Recognition, Confronting Discrimination in Emory Dental School History. And that film was shown here publicly at Emory in 2012, accompanied by an official apology on the part of President James Wagner to a group of these former students that Perry helped gather here and come to Emory for that important event. And then that was followed several years later by the publication of Perry's book, Extracted: Unmasking Rampant Anti-Semitism in America's Higher Education, which not only tells the Emory story and Perry's own personal story, but puts it in a wider national context of discrimination faced by Jews in higher educational institutions of that time. And I always say that Perry's biggest contribution is that he made this a human story. He put, it wasn't just a story of statistics as it had been back when the ADL first uncovered this pattern, but he really tells the story of the people who were affected by this and how it affected them personally. And in doing so, he allowed many of these people the opportunity for healing, which they had never had. Many of these individuals had never processed what had happened to them. Many of them had never told their families about it. And so Perry's work has really provided an opportunity for healing, for personal healing of those individuals, to kind of be recognized, to have what happened to them, discussed and validated, for Emory to be able to apologize for what happened. And so it's a story of healing, of reconciliation, and it really speaks to Perry's character as a person who fostered that sense of reconciliation, and not only worked with the more recent leadership of Emory to bring this about, but in the process became a beloved figure on the Emory campus, a supporter of our institution and a supporter of our Jewish Studies program. So I want to, although in the webinar format, I would normally ask Perry and Shirley Brickman to stand and be recognized, but I want to offer our, virtual applause for them and thank them not only for what they have done for our program and what Perry has done in this very important work, but also what they do, for not only for the Jewish community of Atlanta, but for the community of Atlanta in general, and just recognize them for all their contributions. So that brings me to the second point of this, purpose of this event, which is that after all these events, Emory University and the Laney Graduate School recognized Perry's contributions and those of Art Levin by creating a fellowship to support graduate work in Jewish studies. And the idea behind that is that it was felt that a very appropriate response to this history of exclusion of Jews and marginalization of Jews and Jewish culture would best be answered by a fellowship that promoted the study of Jews and Jewish life and Jewish culture at Emory and made it a permanent and important part of the graduate curriculum. And so the fellowship that has been created in their name provides a stipend for graduate students and allows us to attract the very best graduate students to come to Emory and engage in advanced study on the PhD level of some aspect of Jewish life, history, or culture. And so, it's a very fitting honor that in a place where once many decades ago, a half century ago, there was discrimination against Jews, now has a fellowship in the name of these two heroic individuals, which fosters the study and appreciation of Jewish life and culture in the graduate school. And along with the fellowship, we created this symposium so that occasionally we could have the chance to highlight what graduate work in Jewish studies means. We realized that many people don't have a good understanding of what it means to study Jewish life and culture and history on the graduate level. And so this is a way of displaying, of giving our students a chance to share some of their work, some of their insights in many different disciplines, and to sort of explain to many of our supporters and friends and those interested in these topics what it is that our students on the graduate level do, and to show you how important it is that Emory and the TAM Institute and the various departments in which these students are working are the places where the next generation of scholars who are writing about and researching and teaching in areas related to Jewish studies are producing new and exciting and interesting work. In a minute, I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Bill Gilders, but I just once again want to welcome you all. I want to thank the Brickmans and recognize them, and also thank all of those of you who are here who also have supported the Brickman-Levin Fund. For those of you who are interested in supporting this very worthy endeavor, you'll find a link on the publicity for this program, and also there'll be a follow-up email sent which will direct you to how you can support that program further. So without further ado, I want to now turn the program over to my colleague, Professor Bill Gilders, who is someone who wears several hats and holds many different important roles in our work here. He is a member of the Department of Religion. He is also the chair of the American Religious Cultures course of study in the Graduate Division of Religion. And he's a member of the core faculty of the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies. And also he's part of our executive committee as the director of graduate studies, helping to organize and to serve as a resource and a clearinghouse for students all over the university who are doing work on the graduate level related in some way to Jewish studies. So it's now my pleasure to recognize Professor Gilders, and he'll introduce our program and our speakers.
So yes, thanking my colleague, it is my pleasure as the Director of Graduate Studies for the TAM Institute for Jewish Studies to very briefly introduce how the rest of the evening is going to go, to make a quick initial introduction of our three graduate student speakers, and then to make a slightly more detailed introduction to our first presenter, and that will be the procedure I'll follow for the rest of the evening. The order for tonight's speakers is first Matthew Brittingham from the Graduate Division of Religion, then Keenan Davis from the School of Medicine and the Graduate Division of Religion, and then finally Anastasiia Strakhov from the Department of History. Just let everyone know that we'll be having the speakers one after another, and we'll then have them address questions at the end after the third presentation. We'll be using the Q&A function for receiving questions, and I'll recommend that those in attendance hold their questions until we get to the question and answer time, and that way as they come in at that point, I'll be able to process them and pass them along to our speakers. So to introduce first Matthew Brittingham, he's a PhD candidate in the Graduate Division of Religion, working in the area of American Judaism, with a focus on the intersection between religion and print culture in 19th and 20th century American Jewish history. He's also interested in American religious cultures, religious studies theory, Yiddish language and literature, and Jewish participation in modern sport. And his presentation is titled, Thinking About Free Thinkers, Depictions of Free-Thinking Jewish Immigrants in the American Yiddish Press, 1890s to 1920s. So over to Matthew. I'm going to mute myself so I don't.
Hopefully everybody can see my screen just fine. Eric, give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. All right, fabulous. You're one of the few people I can see right now. So to start, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Goldstein and Dr. Gilders, as well as Brent and Paul for all of their work, as well as anybody else who might have helped out with organizing or supporting this event. And it's a great opportunity to share our research, and thank you to colleagues and people in the broader public who are also attending and will be asking your questions. So I first want to say a couple comments about what got me interested in this topic. In general, I've always been fascinated by the kinds of tensions, negotiations, and questions the religious and irreligious have faced in the modern age. But more specifically, I became interested in Jewish free thinkers after really years ago, coming across a serialized Yiddish novel from 1922 about a family of Jewish immigrant free thinkers who were living in and around New York. I began to do more research into the topic of free thinkers in general, who and what they were, and as well as their depictions in the American Yiddish press during the heyday of the American Yiddish press, which is really from the 1890s to the 1920s. So I started to really think about some really big questions, like how did the depiction of Jewish free thinkers in America transform over time in the popular Yiddish press? And what role did the free thinker as an image play in discussions and debates surrounding Jewish immigrant politics and culture? As well as what do these depictions say about Jewish immigrant acculturation or adaptation to the American context? As a religion scholar, I was especially interested in how depictions of Jewish immigrant free thinkers spoke to tensions in Jewish identity in a voluntaristic American society. That is, a context where Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe felt freer to relinquish religious observance or to eschew Jewish identity altogether. But they also were encountering a context where religious diversity, religious identity, and religious rhetoric were very strong. Now, I've been using this term, the free thinker, or a free thinker, already, but really what was a free thinker? So a free thinker was really, it's always been used as a very broad term to refer to, as one scholar said, quote, a phenomena that runs the gamut from the truly anti-religious, those who regarded all religion as forms of superstition and wished to reduce its influence in every aspect of society, to those who adhered to a private, unconventional faith, revering some form of God or providence, but at odds with orthodox religious authority, end quote. So it really encapsulated both deists, the term really encapsulated both deists and atheists, but was not necessarily reducible to only these religious ideas or ideas about religion as well. And it really signaled especially a general rejection of traditional forms of religious authority. So as Jewish immigrants began arriving from Eastern Europe to the United States in vast numbers, really beginning in the 1880s, it also happened to be a golden age of free thought in America. And Jewish immigrant free thinkers were actually quite distinct in many ways from native-born free thinkers. They tended to be more politically radical, especially joining political philosophies like anarchism and socialism. And they were, of course, part of the immigrant working class. And so they tended to be Yiddish speaking or Russian speaking, but also were poorer than many native-born free thinkers. And so really my dissertation research focuses especially on who these Jewish immigrant free thinkers were and how some of these conversations happened surrounding Jewish immigrant free thinkers in the popular American Yiddish press, including journalists, but also editors and even fiction writers as well. And by popular American Yiddish press, it's really, I focus on Yiddish newspapers such as the Vorwärts being one of the most popular of the American Yiddish newspapers in the early 1900s. So as these Jewish immigrants are arriving in the United States, many free-thinking Jewish immigrants are attracted to these ideologies, political ideologies like socialism and anarchism. And that is where much of my research really, or the chapters of my dissertation really begin. So chapter 1 really thinks a lot about how free-thinking Jewish journalists presented free thought to readers of the popular Yiddish press. And I particularly focus on free-thinking socialists because they really had to thread a very interesting needle that spoke to some of the complexities of being a free thinker in the Jewish immigrant context. They really held on to something that was called internationalism, socialist internationalism, in which they hoped for the eventual dissolution of distinctions between Jews and non-Jews. And they hoped that all Jews and non-Jews would eventually assimilate into the same working class melting pot. And so they naturally saw, these free-thinking Jewish radicals naturally saw religion as something that was to be fought and contested. On the other hand, they held to a very pragmatic socialism that was adapted and adopted from German immigrant socialists. And this pragmatic approach really stated that religion was also a matter of private concern. So on the one hand, they were challenging religious authority and personal religious beliefs. But on the other hand, they were trying to stress that a person could be a socialist and also be religious. And so this chapter really gets at the heart of some of these tensions for American Jewish free thinkers. So the real meat of my research, especially, is in the period between 1897 and 1914. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, there were notable events in Eastern Europe, like violent attacks on Jews called pogroms, and the rise of expressly Jewish political movements that were also socialist or generally revolutionary. And that led many free-thinking Jewish radicals to question the idea of this kind of Jewish internationalism, this assimilation into a working class culture. And in the late 1890s, there was a rise of popular, radically oriented Yiddish writers in the United States who were beginning to challenge some of these big questions and ideas about Jewish socialist assimilation. And so by really the middle of the first decade of the 1900s, the tone really shifts and changes, where really some of the kind of hardline internationalists are on their back heels. And there's a rise in things like advice columns and socialist dailies that are dealing with some of the problems and tensions in Jewish immigrant life, as Jewish immigrants, whether they're religious or free thinking, are coming into contact with each other. And they're trying to figure out how to really embrace a very American sense of tolerance in their everyday life. And this also bubbles up into debates amongst Jewish freethinkers about how they should or can relate to Jewish traditions, to the point that by really the 19-teens, these free-thinking Jewish immigrants are still remaining free-thinking, but they're starting to really adapt what it means to be a free thinker and starting to really embrace more of Jewish tradition that would be almost unthinkable just a couple decades prior. And the conservative Yiddish press is also another area of interest for me, where they start to really keen in on the fact that these Jewish radicals who once had advocated for a really strong sense of assimilation were now advocating for an embrace of Jewish tradition. And they start to also write editorials and short stories where they themselves are also kind of mocking and challenging Jewish immigrant free thinkers. Much of my story really ends in after World War I, where some of these debates, they kind of both heated up and cooled down depending on different writers and different circles, different intellectual circles. And especially coming out of really the aftermath of World War I, and there's a rise in anti-Semitism in the United States, there's a considerable amount of conversation about how to, there's a kind of a revisiting of some of these conversations about what it looks like to be a free thinker and also be very, very fiercely or very strongly Jewish, and what that looks like. And so these debates are still ongoing. They still happen in the Yiddish press during these years and even after it. But some of the main kind of tensions are really worked out in the wake of World War I. So my scholarship really contributes to several different conversations. One of those is the study of Jewish immigrant Americanization, especially in terms of religious life, a surprisingly understudied area of American Jewish history. And it also contributes in general to the study of American religion, but also the study of American irreligion, both of which American religion has gotten much more has been much more of a topic of conversation than American irreligion, but it also contributes to both of those areas of study as well. So I will leave it at that with a very kind of 50-foot view of some of my work and turn it over to one of my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And again, I will continue with introductions. Our next speaker is Keenan Davis, who is both a PhD candidate in the Graduate Division of Religion, where he concentrates on religious practices and practical theology, and an MD candidate in the Emory School of Medicine. His dissertation, Aspiring to Autonomy, ethnographically investigates the first-person experiences of patients undergoing deep brain stimulation in the treatment of psychiatric conditions, which he brings into conversation with the fields of bioethics, disability studies, anthropology of ethics, and cognitive science. His presentation is titled, What Can Levinas Teach Us About Experimental Brain Surgery? So over to you, Keenan.
Okay, I had to find the unmute button there for a second. Okay, let's see if we can get that working. Excellent. Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Dr. Gilders, for your introduction. As you heard, I'm Keenan Davis, an MD PhD student in the Graduate Division of Religion and a TAM Institute Fellow. And I'm going to do my best to give you just a 10-minute introduction to my dissertation work. So my research tries to bridge the medical and the religious or existential by focusing on the firsthand experience of patients undergoing deep brain stimulation, or DBS, to treat their otherwise treatment-resistant depression. So DBS is an experimental device that's in clinical trials to test its effectiveness in treating depression. So this is all very new. And for this reason, I think it's worth trying to understand what the patients themselves think about the experience. I found so far that there's a lot we can learn from these patients in their very novel, unique situation that speaks to more general ethical and philosophical questions. And my project has been juxtaposing the ways in which they describe their course of recovery with the language of different thinkers, including, for the purposes of this talk especially, Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, to see what kind of light they might shed on one another. So very briefly, what is DBS? DBS, deep brain stimulation, involves the surgical implantation of electrodes that deliver electrical pulses to a specific region of the brain. I have not done the surgery. I don't plan on ever doing the surgery. I'm just studying it. It's commonly described as a pacemaker for the brain. And at this point, it's well established in the treatment of movement disorders like Parkinson's disease and essential tremor. As I mentioned, it's now also being investigated for uses in psychiatric conditions like obsessive compulsive disorder, and in our case, treatment-resistant depression. The subjects of this research are patients for whom other interventions like antidepressant drugs and electroconvulsive therapy no longer work or never did work in the first place. DBS for them is something of a last resort. I'm happy to report that the results have been quite promising. Most of the patients treated, including those that I've been following here at Emory, have seen significant improvement in their condition, with many in full remission, thank God. However, something big is being missed by the standardized depression ratings and scales that determine medical efficacy, and by much of the conversation about DBS in the field of bioethics. And that is the personal experience of the individual patients, their lived story, the nuances of what this treatment course feels like, what it actually means to them, the really deep stuff, if you will. If you look through the bioethics journal articles about DBS, you'll find that much of the debate surrounds abstract questions like, does DBS threaten the patient's autonomy? And autonomy is one of these big buzzwords in bioethics that we'll return to in a few minutes. And there's actually, looking through these articles, a funny pattern that after pages and pages of armchair speculation about the impact of DBS on autonomy, a lot of them conclude with a comment like, ultimately, we'll need to speak to the patients themselves to find out what's really going on. So that's what I'm doing. My research primarily explores years of interviews conducted by psychiatrists with a number of my own follow-up interviews. And these interviews start in the month leading up to the patient's initial surgery, the implantation of the device, and then they continue weekly until 6 months post-implantation, and then less frequently as time goes on. Some of these patients have now had the device for years, almost 10 years. So ultimately, my project is what you might call a phenomenology of recovery. So what is phenomenology? That is a big word. Phenomenology is a branch of philosophy that analyzes the subjective experience of certain phenomena, the way certain things appear to us firsthand, in hopes of discovering something about the structures of consciousness or of experience itself. And more than just a branch of philosophy, phenomenology has also come to refer to a research methodology as well, the sort of the in-depth exploration of subjective experiences. So here are some phenomenological examples of how DBS patients experienced their refractory depression before the device went into effect. So you'll notice they draw on a lot of different metaphors and physical analogies for their experience. It's quite difficult to put mental phenomena into words that can be shared, but that's a whole other talk we could do. But here, I'll just point out a little bit. In full restraints, they felt frozen or paralyzed, down in a pit without the motivation to escape, a locked padded cell, or a prison that my brain has put me in. Note also here how for this patient, brain is conceptualized as other than the self. I think this is interesting. There's me and there's my brain over there that acts on me. So that's another fascinating pattern among the patients that we can talk about at the end if you'd like. Here is a longer comment that was made by one of our more reflective patients that I'll read for you. I was separated from the world somehow, my experiences and everything outside of myself, the ability of people, experiences, and the world to get to me, for me to experience them. And then inside, also, there was a desperate sense, an urgency, urgent in a sense that I had to pay attention to it. I could attend to nothing else. So other patients similarly described being trapped in their head or everything becoming self-centered in a way that was sickening and frustrating or disappointing. Essentially, the patients, before the device starts working, feel stuck focusing inward, trapped in their own mind. So hearing these conceptualizations of their illness, I was actually reminded of a quote from the Talmud Bavli here, the Babylonian Talmud in Brachot. So, Ein chavush matir atzmo mi beit asurim. One who is imprisoned cannot free himself, which is stated in the Gemara in the context of a discussion about suffering, in which a famous healer, Rabbi Yochanan, finds himself unable to heal himself and requires the help of someone else. And the Gemara says, like, why doesn't he just heal himself? He's so good at this. But one who's in prison cannot free himself. So I was also reminded of an essay by philosopher and Talmudic commentator Emmanuel Levinas. His essay is called Useless Suffering, and it's actually based on his reading of this Gemara from Brachot. So as we'll see in a moment, this concept, one who's imprisoned cannot free himself, plays a central role in Levinas's thought more generally. So who was Levinas? Levinas was a 20th century Jewish philosopher who also happened to be part of the phenomenological tradition in philosophy that I mentioned before, and whose work I believe can help us think through the experience of these DBS patients. Levinas famously argues that not only can we not free ourselves from the prison of suffering, which he writes about in that essay, without the help of another, and as was described in the Gemara, indeed, consciousness itself requires liberation from another. So this is a really deep concept. What is it? What could this mean? So what Levinas says is that if not for the encounter with another person, we'd be essentially trapped in our ego, trapped in our head, sort of like the DBS patients described their depression, almost autopiloting in survival mode. For some people, this might mean just mindlessly fulfilling bodily needs, And for others, like the DBS patients, it might mean feeling stuck, imprisoned. And so this is where the other comes in. In Levinas's account, subjectivity means being subject to. It means being pulled out of the self by another to attend to things outside the self, specifically the needs of that vulnerable other. So this primordial responsibility grounds Levinas's big claim that consciousness is inherently ethical. Now, it's important to note, consciousness being inherently ethical does not mean that we automatically make morally good or correct choices. We know that's not true. But rather what he means is simply that it's subject to ethical demands from the start. So we're responsible for our choices, whether we like it or not. So for Levinas, before we are free to make a choice, indeed, before we're even able to start thinking through the choice, categorizing things, understanding our options, we are responsible for the other. Our freedom itself and our consciousness and sense of meaning are conditioned and made possible by this pull to respond to the other. So here you can see how wordy the phenomenologist can be. We won't go through the entire quotation closely, but the gist of what he's describing is a more nuanced take, I think, on the notion of autonomy than just, I want what I want and I should be free to pursue it, which unfortunately is one of the common ways that autonomy is treated in mainstream medical ethics. So what he calls here a new autonomy, true freedom, is not being an unthinking slave to one's ego and bodily needs, but being freed from the ego, able to take on meaningful responsibility. Elected, you'll see he says, in passing reference to Judaism, elected to a unique identity and role that is more than just pursuing base desires. Okay, so that's a very basic intro to Levinas. There's a lot more to him, but that's what we're going to use. And so what I'll focus on for these last couple of minutes of my talk is the fascinating finding, I think, that our DBS patients' experience of recovery in many ways maps onto Levinas's descriptions of consciousness. So here's some more excerpts from the interviews with our patients. We saw earlier that when they were depressed, they felt trapped, perpetually focused inward, a symptom classically called rumination. Then, almost in slow motion, over weeks and months as the device takes effect, they are re-enabled to focus outward, to attend to things beyond. So here are some things that patients said about this experience. You'll notice here that a lot of them are framed in terms of augmented perception, phenomena now being available to their consciousness in new or different ways. So you can see somebody said it turns the lights on. I can now see color, see clearly, know what's going on around me. A vividity that enabled the noticing of details in nature. Seeing that there's beauty, so their aesthetic sense becomes available to them again. And then in addition to this newfound receptivity, the ability to perceive things anew, comes increased responsiveness, the ability and desire to engage with others, to feel that pull of responsibility that Levinas describes, the motivation to act on it, and the ability to do so more naturally, even joyfully, without needing to overthink it. So you can see somebody said, I'll play and wrestle with my daughter. I'm more involved in what people are saying and doing, more willing to participate. So since time is short, I'll conclude with just these last quotations that illustrate Levinas's big argument that meaning, even life-sustaining meaning, emerges from our responsibility to others and orients our consciousness. These two patients here explain that now that they're able to attend to things beyond their suffering, they're able to deeply evaluate what their values are or should be, how they're going to live up to the pull of responsibility. In a sense, they're able now to aspire to a new autonomy. So you can see, this is a great quote. It says, I'm thinking, okay, now what am I going to do with my future? How am I going to be able to help society out? I've got to figure that out. It's scary, but I like it. So thank you all very much for your attention, and thanks to the TAM Institute and to my advisor, Professor Don Seaman, for all your support.
Again, thank you very much, Keenan. And last but definitely not least, we're going to hear from Anastasiia Strakhov. who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History, where she specializes in modern Jewish history, Russian history, and migration. In her dissertation, she examines how the racialization of Jews in late imperial Russia functioned through migration policies and everyday border crossing practices. She also analyzes how thousands of Jews were able to leave the Russian Empire during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when imperial legislation forbade immigration, and the roles Jews themselves played in shaping this process. Her presentation is titled Selective Emigration, Border Control, and the Jewish Escape in Late Imperial Russia, 1881 to 1914. So once again, over to Anastasiia for our final presentation.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen now, just a moment. Okay, so now you should be able to see my screen. So thank you so much for the introduction. And my presentation is based on my dissertation, and you can see the title here, and also it was already presented. In my dissertation, I study the ambiguous situation in late imperial Russia between 1881 and 1914. So the Russian government prohibited immigration. Nevertheless, thousands of Jews crossed Russia's border every month, searching for better economic opportunities. So how was it possible? I argue that paradoxically, Jews benefited from their marginal status in the empire. Restricting immigration of non-Jews, the government made the Jewish departure semi-legal, so to say, when it approved several Jewish immigration organizations starting in 1892. And there was no such organizations for other ethnic groups in the Russian Empire. Then I solved the second conundrum of Russian Jewish immigration. If Jews could apply for official immigration documents through Jewish immigration associations, why did the majority, at least 75%, or some sources name up to 90%, still preferred illegal border crossing? And I argue that Russian imperial attempts to manage immigration were insufficient, and ordinary immigrants striving for free movement proved stronger than the government's restrictive policies. The government also failed to separate Jewish and non-Jewish streams of migration, and Jews were, so to say, immigration pioneers who trod the path for non-Jews. Here, I mean, first of all, Jewish immigration agents who were quite successful in Western imperial borderlands. I draw my conclusion from studying over 1,000 bureaucratic letters, institutional archival records, press publications, and immigrants' personal accounts in Russian, Yiddish, and Hebrew. To collect my primary sources, I worked in over a dozen American, Israeli, and former Russian imperial archives, and many of my research trips were sponsored by the Town Institute for Jewish Studies. Here you can see the table of contents of my dissertation, and my 6 dissertation chapters demonstrate that although the Russian government implicitly and sometimes explicitly supported the immigration of Jews, its attempts to filter their departure from the non-Jewish exits failed. So my first chapter, The Impossible Departures, Tsarist immigration legislation and clandestine border crossing between 1881 and 1891, discusses the imperial laws restricting international travel and the emergence of Jewish smugglers' rings that constantly, oh my God, sorry, what's happening? Okay. My first chapter discusses the imperial laws restricting international travel and the emergence of Jewish smugglers' rings that constantly challenge the rigidity of the Russian juridical system. In Chapter 2, Policies of Filtration, Imperial Support of the Jewish Exodus, I argue that even as the Russian authorities attempted to prevent the immigration of non-Jewish peasant laborers, they implicitly encouraged the Jewish exodus. The imperial desire to promote and regulate Jewish immigration culminated in legislation governing the establishment and operation of Jewish immigration organizations. So in my third chapter, Unexpected Allies, Jewish immigration associations and the Russian state between 1892 and 1914, I discuss how the combined efforts of the Russian government and local and foreign philanthropists attempted to alter the broader landscape of the Russian Jewish existence. And then I talk about these associations. I mean, first of all, the Jewish Colonization Association, established and sponsored by Baron Hirsch. However, very few Jewish immigrants responded to the society's initiatives. So the migration was possible to become legal through these organizations, but very few immigrants actually took this opportunity. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, something between 75 to 90% of immigration still happened illegally. So my chapter 4, A Losing Fight, the Jewish Immigration Association Against Illegal Travel Agents, 1892-1914, analyzes the power struggle between the government-sponsored Jewish immigration organizations and illegal travel agents over immigration, Jewish immigration supervision. My ethnic economic niche, Jewish smugglers and the enforcement of anti-Semitic biases, between again 1892 and 1914, traces how the anti-Semitic prejudice and a growing fear of Jewish smugglers' ability to contravene imperial laws and border regulations encouraged a growing number of exceptions to the Tsarist regime's filtration policies. Therefore, while supporting Jewish immigration in general, the authorities increasingly opposed the departure of Jewish soldiers, colonists, agricultural colonists, political criminals, and prostitutes. Reasons for excluding these categories were different, but in general, their immigration was discouraged, unlike immigration of other Jews. My last chapter, Benefits of Marginality, Jewish legal travel agents and their networks, highlights the agency and influence of ordinary Jews as opposed to government officials in guiding the immigration process. I explore this theme through immigrants' decision-making and the development of illegal Jewish immigration strategies to get around the law. And I would be happy to talk more about any of these chapters in Q&A. Now I'm just trying to give a brief overview of in general. So overall, from my research, I demonstrate how ordinary immigrants and illegal immigration facilitators had much more agency that previous scholarship attributes them. This included also many female agents who were among the most successful. And my last slide is the Pale of Jewish settlement in the Russian Empire and the Kingdom of Poland. This is the area there the majority of Jews lived in the Russian Empire. And this is the areas from which they immigrated the most. Thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of our presenters for their clarity and focus. And I'll just say on a personal level, I learned a great deal already and really enjoyed these presentations. So I'm glad I was able to be part of this event. As I noted at the beginning, we'll be able to take questions through the Q&A function. So if you are here at the event and have a question, please type it into the Q&A and I will be processing these through. So the first question goes to Anastasiia. Can you tell us about the documents that you used in your research? And let me see, yes, there was a question about obtaining a copy of the thesis, which I think we can answer generally that over the long term, these dissertations will end up being available in various ways, and then ultimately they will be published by top-ranking academic presses. But at this juncture, the question is about research sources. So please go ahead.
So my maybe number one source is the police records that are called in the Russian Imperial Archives, mostly in the archives that are now in the Russian Federation, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And I was very happy, very lucky to visit those archives a couple of years ago, because now I think it will be quite impossible, especially considering that I'm from Ukraine. But luckily I have these police records and I can work with them, and I made copies of them. Of course, their reliability is questionable because, of course, the police was also anti-Semitic and tried to portray Jews as criminals in many ways, and exaggerate the number of Jews in this illegal immigration business. So I'm quite aware of how problematic the police reports are, but nevertheless, this is one of the few resources that I can use to reconstruct this historical picture of immigration process, especially illegal immigration process. Then I also use the internal documentation of Jewish immigration organizations such as Jewish Colonization Association and Jewish Immigration Society. The first one was active in St. Petersburg, and another one had its main office in Kiev. And copies of the Kiev agency is actually available at Ivo Institute for Jewish Research in New York. They made copies from the city archive of Kiev. And this includes the correspondence between different representatives of these associations, the reports, not just the annual reports that these organizations published, but the reports that local representatives sent them. And I think they are much more accurate than we can see published as annual reports. And also I use the press. Yeah.
Thank you. I think I will extend and perhaps pivot that question to our other two speakers as well, as a question about nature of the sources you've used, problems you might have encountered with them, if each of you, starting with Matthew and then Keenan, might say a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in terms of the sources I use, and this is something I realized after I was done, I didn't talk as much about, but I use a lot of the Yiddish press itself, which, I mean, in some ways, really studying at this time is really great because there's now a new Yiddish OCR, so it's a lot easier to find certain phrases and words in many ways, but so some of that is related to that, but I still have to go through and do a lot of work on microfilm, which, you know, isn't readable in the same way. So that can be a challenge. And sometimes there's just work that's just missing, that just wasn't archived or included in microfilm. But I also have visited the YIVO archives and looked at a lot of documents related to different journalists and different newspapers. There is one of the problems I find is that when it comes to the popular Yiddish press, especially really early stuff in the 1890s and into the first decade of the 1900s, there's just not a lot of stuff that's been kept or saved, in part because of the politics of Yiddish. So that certainly is a problem that I sometimes find. So I try to supplement it by looking at memoirs that were written and various different kind of retrospectives that were done also in the Yiddish press in later years. So.
Thank you. And Keenan.
Sure. So the main sources that I'm drawing on are, we have hundreds of hours of footage of interviews done by the psychiatrists who are running this clinical trial with the patients themselves. And then I also have conducted a few interviews myself as follow-up. I guess one concern that I had before I started was, what's the risk that these interviews are going to be overly clinical and dry and boring and symptom focused? But I was very pleasantly surprised to find that the psychiatrists ask a lot about the more existential and transcendent questions. So there was a lot of good material there. And the hardest part was just transcribing it all. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun, honestly.
All right, thank you. There is another question that's come in, I believe, again, is addressed to Anastasiia. Generally, governments are quicker to enact prohibitions than they are to appropriate money to enforce them. Did you notice any increase in border control appropriations corresponding with the prohibition in emigration?
In general, the imperial immigration policies were very inconsistent, and many sources demonstrate very different pictures, and it's sometimes quite difficult to draw a coherent narrative and analysis of those documents, because as one of Israeli scholars told me when I explained my problem to him, that like when we're talking about Russian imperial government, the one hand didn't know like what the other hand was doing. So what I noticed in my research, that at the beginning of mass migration, the government paid lesser control to their western borderlands, and then very curiously and paradoxically, at the beginning of 20th century, some ministers started talking about making immigration legal on the official level, and maybe to ease some immigration restrictions for non-Jews as well. But at the same time, when all those discussions were happening on the top level between the ministers, and they had several interdepartmental commissions which discussed different possibilities of how to ease immigration policies. On the ground, actually, we see reinforcement of those policies of the politics of migration. So there is a constant inconsistency about what was going on the top level in St. Petersburg and what was going on the ground. But as the immigration grew, as immigration gained momentum, the profession of illegal travel agents became more and more profitable and popular, and more Jews came to this market of illegal immigration just because the Pale of Settlement was overpopulated, there were lack of jobs, and this is the area they could earn money. through time, through years, they learn how to bypass all these restrictions, how to bribe certain bureaucrats, some officials, local officials, how to bribe certain border guards, or how to forge documents. So we do see some reinforcement of border control through years, but at the same time, this illegal travel agents, they were quite adaptive to what was going on.
Bill, I have a question I'd like to
Yes,
ask.
please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Just to help our audience better understand sort of what's entailed in these types of scholarly projects, one of the key things that scholars do in writing books and that graduate students do in writing dissertations is that we're engaging with a larger literature in our field. Each of our fields, no matter what discipline, have an accumulation of works and ideas that are common to the field, and each of us tries to intervene in that in some way and correct things that we think are wrong or argue against received knowledge, introduce new ideas. So I'm wondering if each of the speakers could say something about an example of something in their work that goes against some of the received knowledge. How is your work intervening in a way that challenges a previous thesis or tries to argue something in a different direction than what previous scholarship in your field has suggested?
And I'll put Keenan on the spot, get him to go first.
That's fine. So I think I can speak to a couple layers of critique that exist that my project is trying to engage with. So I mentioned in my talk that in bioethics, mainstream bioethics, autonomy is this buzzword, and there are now decades of critiques written against this very superficial understanding of autonomy as just, I want what I want and I'm gonna get it, you can't tell me no. And right now, one of the most popular imagination of autonomy is relational autonomy, which draws attention to context, which is a very good thing. It's a step in the right direction. It says, no, we have to attend to race and gender and socioeconomic status, and all these things inform the sort of decisions that somebody's going to make in a given moment. But I'm hoping to draw on thinkers like Levinas to say, that is a step in the right direction, but actually we can go even further, that relational autonomy still treats autonomy as a sort of momentary decision or act of the will, when in fact autonomy is something that I think is much more dynamic, something that happens over time, that is enacted and embodied, and that it's not just a, what do I want in this moment? How do I envision getting it? So there's just one example.
Thank you. And I'll ask Anastasiia to go next.
Yeah, thank you. So again, the trick is in my sources, because when I try to uncover voices of this Jewish illegal agents, the only information that I have about them is the negative information, because the police reports usually deal with some illegality, with some criminal activities. And again, the press, both Jewish and non-Jewish press, they usually went against this immigration agents, saying that like they're not very good people, they deceive immigrants, they cheat them, they try to just make money on their sufferings. So all the sources that I have about the agents, they are portraying them in a very bad light. And a lot of scholarship that has been done on illegal travel agents before me also appropriated this language of treating those immigrants as criminals exclusively. But I'm trying to see something good in them, to see them as people who just took the opportunities of this growing immigration job market and they had families, big families. They sometimes and quite often they had some other job, and this immigration activities, illegal immigration activities, was just like a side job. So I'm trying to see them more like ordinary people who just use those opportunities. And then, as I discuss in my fourth chapter, even though the Russian authorities and legal government-approved Jewish immigration organizations, even though they tried to prevent, to minimize activities of illegal travel agents, still the majority of people applied for their services, for the services of illegal agents. So I'm asking in my dissertation why it was like that, and also probably not everything was so bad. Not every agent was a cheater. Not every agent tried to deceive people. There were many people among them who were just doing their job. They knew how to do that, and they were doing their jobs. So I think this is one of the my key interventions, is that I'm trying to look at those agents as normal people, as ordinary people, not just criminals.
And finally, over to Matthew.
Yeah, I think the in the study of American Jewish history, especially this period of immigration, there's a common story that's told that is the idea of a very rapid secularization of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, that as they were on the boat on their way to the United States, they tossed their tefillin into the water, and and that was when, by the time they landed in the United States, they were ready to just shed all sense of Jewish observance and Jewish religious observance. But that idea has been challenged for, I would say, a number of decades. I think my work really adds to that and really joins in on that conversation to say that, realistically, even some of the, especially certain kind of radical figures who considered themselves to be anti-religious, were really, really playful with religious concepts, religious ideas, and religious rhetoric in ways that was certainly not actually distancing themselves from religion, even while they were sometimes using those words, but was actually drawing them into conversation with it in really dynamic and innovative ways. And that Jewish immigrants in general during this period, whether they were on the more radical side, conservative side, or somewhere in between, were doing a lot of this negotiation in very challenging times. So I would certainly say that's really where, at least for me, where some of my funnest intervention is.
All right. Thank you very much. And again, I'll thank our three graduate student speakers who've shared their work with us. We don't have any further questions, and we've reached the time that we had on our schedule. So I just want to wrap up by noting, I'm checking my notes here. Just want to thank everyone for tuning in and invite you to register for an event we have coming up on Monday, book launch for Jason Francisco at 7:30 p.m. on Monday, April the 11th. Attendees will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with the link to register. So if you've been registered for this event as an attendee, you'll get a follow-up note about that. That ends my, there's something else coming up as a question. There's a question about the recording being available. Brent or Paul or Eric, I think, could answer that question.
The recording will be available. It won't be available right away, but like many of our programs, we do post it on the TAM Institute website. So I would give it a week or so, and then you can check on our website where we have the recordings of the programs. So
I think that brings us to the end. Was there anything else you wanted to say, Eric? Or
no, I just want to thank everybody for coming. Again, I'd like to thank the Brickmans. I'd like to thank Professor Gilders for moderating, and thank our three excellent students. And I hope, you know, this program gave you a little taste of some of these works in progress and the many different topics that graduate students are pursuing in the area of Jewish studies.
Right. Thank you. And I guess we can all begin the process of signing off. This is always the awkward moment at the end of an event like this, as we sort of figure out how to say goodbye.
All right. Thank you for joining us.